there.
Okay, red light?
Yep, that's the...
Thank you. All right, so what I'm going to be talking about today is how we use sociocracy in projects with usually medium to large organizations, sometimes smaller, including government agencies. So let's jump right into it. A little bit about me. So I've been doing open source programming and other related work for the better part of 2 decades. I mostly work in the public sector, so at an agency, but with clients that are either governments, nonprofits, NGOs, some international, some local, some nationwide. I'm particularly interested, I have a degree in philosophy, so I'm particularly interested in things like how people make decisions collaboratively together. So that's really been one of my passions, and sociocracy is the best way that I have found to do that, and so I'm happy to share that today. So at the end of the day, I'm going to be looking at sociocracy at a couple different levels, as we'll see, but in particular, we're going to be continuing to touch back to how to do it in a project, so kind of bringing the scope down to something useful. And what we found in many, many years of working on these kind of projects is that how much people care about the project success has a huge impact, right? And that can be affected by a lot of different things, but more often than not is people being disengaged because they don't feel that they're being heard, right? And that leads to other things, people having different priorities, not understanding the aims of the project, and so forth. And then unclear decisions is something that a lot of people don't often recognize in projects, because everybody thinks that the decision that was made is clear, but different perspectives mean that people are looking at understanding things differently. And so this is all how we try to kind of, the different techniques that we'll see a little later on about how to try to manage that. Another note just on this one is that people feeling unheard is endemic, and it's something that's really hard to identify because clearly you're not asking those people, right? If they're feeling unheard, it's because they're not being engaged. And so it's one of those things that I can almost guarantee in every project, anybody who's ever said something like, this could have been an email, that's what's going on, right? So we're going to look at this in a couple different contexts. So I'm going to just briefly look at it from sort of the broader level of how sociocracy works at an organizational structural level, because that's really what it was designed for. But then we've been applying those same techniques in discovery workshops, which is a type of project that we work on. I'll get into it a little bit more. But where the actual work of the project, sociocracy helps tremendously at that. And then also more generally in project delivery. So we do agile project management, where we're iteratively building things and we're doing sprint reviews and so forth. And we'll see how we actually, at the meeting level, use a lot of techniques from sociocracy to engage people at that level. So let's just take a look at what sociocracy is. So it's a governance system that's designed around collaboration and consensus-based decision making. That's the main thing that sociocracy is designed for. And the core idea behind all of this is that everybody's voice matters. This is sort of it's equality and participation. It's all the fancy nice things that people talk about when we talk about democracy and so forth. But it's bringing it to an organizational level. One of the really key elements of it is transparency. So not everybody's going to be involved in every decision, but you need to be able to see why people came to certain decisions. Otherwise, you end up relitigating decisions and having the same debates over and over again, and it erodes trust and so forth. So transparency is super important. And then in getting everybody's voice into the conversation, you're getting ongoing feedback, and that allows you to improve on an ongoing basis. So when we say that every voice matters, like, what does that mean? Like, why should we care? At a very practical level, there's been a lot of sociological research that's shown that having a diverse input into decisions is by far the best way to make better decisions. You avoid all kinds of things like echo chambers, where everybody having the same background and the same interests mean that you're narrowing the scope of what you're considering as options to solve a given problem. And by having a lot of different experiences coming into the conversation, you're much more likely to find risks earlier, right? That people will be like, we've done something similar, and it worked out this way or that way. Right? Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So the core principles are basically these four. So consent-based decision-making, we'll look at each of these in a little bit more depth as we go along. A circle structure, so that's how an organization would be structured. Double linking is how circles basically are like decision-making bodies, so small committees usually, small teams. And how those circles are connected with each other is what this double linking is. So we'll look at that a little bit more. And then continuous improvement, which I've already mentioned, and I'm going to kind of ignore from this point forward. Okay? Like there's always an iterative process, but most of it has to do with some fairly specific things. So we'll look at it at kind of two levels. There's the macro level of how an organization works, and then the micro level of how we actually operate within meetings to affect some of this stuff. So at the macro level, we're talking about an organization and a shared mission, and how that mission breaks down into more specific aims, and then the responsibilities that are required for the different parts of the organization to achieve those aims. That's what we refer to as a domain. A domain is a set of responsibilities that sort of attach to an aim that allow you to pursue that aim effectively. A lot of times in alternative organizations, there's this idea of being flat, right? Not wanting managers, trying to do away with hierarchy. In this case, sociocracy achieves the underlying goals that people are trying to express that in, but there is still a hierarchy. The hierarchy, though, is one of specificity. Okay? So what you'll have as sort of your baseline within an organization is a mission circle and a general circle. Again, these are small committees made up of people who are participating in these ongoing meetings to set policy, deal with operational things, and so forth. And the mission circle's sort of the equivalent of the board of directors generally, in terms of like a more traditional organization. It's making sure that you're focused on the mission of the organization. General circle is the management team, if you will. Again, it doesn't quite work the way a traditional organization would be, but that would be sort of that committee. They're tasked with effectuating the mission, right? Making it real. That's what general circle is. Those two are kind of the baseline that you're going to find across any sociocratic organization. And then, depending on what you're trying to do, what your mission is, what the aims are, and so forth, you'll delegate those responsibilities to child circles who will have more specific things. So let me just take a quick step away from this, and let me show you a nifty little Drupal application that we've been building that is intended. You see this okay? Yeah. This shows the organizational structure of consensus enterprises, right? So we've got our mission circle and our general circle, and then we have three subcircles under that. Sustainable growth, that's our sales and marketing and project delivery. And then we have people, which is all about hiring and all of our HR policies and that kind of thing. And then operations is all of the administrative stuff, right? And then we've got some subcircles under that, so sustainable growth. We have staff augmentation, our products and hosting, and our services and support. So the types of services that we provide. And you can see there's a little number here. That's how many people are in each of these committees, right? And so, within this is a thing called synchrony that we've been building. And, within a given circle, we've got links to things. We've got the aims of this particular circle. We haven't actually done the work. We've implemented the feature. We haven't actually filled it with the content of what the responsibilities would be for each of these domains, who the members are, and then what roles each of them play and for how long, right? So this is just, I'm not going to go into any more detail than that, but all of this is basically how Sociocracy works. Next week, if you're interested, there's a Sociocracy conference online that everybody's welcome to. My colleague Derek, who's with us here, is going to be demoing Synchrony at that point, and Sociocracy for All, the host organization, has been experimenting with it, and we're looking to partner with them about that. So this is not directly relevant to how projects would work here. It can be if we have a big project where we've got a large team and it starts to make sense to subdivide it into subcircles or helper circles. The main thing to take into account here is that all of this, while there's that specificity, is goal-focused, right? We're trying to achieve something, and the way that we subdivide our responsibilities is not because Jane is responsible for this and has a team, and John is responsible for that and is managing this other team, but rather, how are we going to divide those aims and delegate them to those sub-circles and really hand off that responsibility to them. And they're going to be responsible for making the decisions and effectuating the work, and then reporting that back so that that transparency can be communicated to the rest of the organization. Let me pop this back into slideshow mode. All right, so when we saw there that we had different circles, we were going left to right because we don't want it to be sort of top down, but it could be represented the same way. There is a hierarchy. That hierarchy is one specificity. And as you go from a parent circle to a child circle, the connection between them is the leader and the delegate. This is that double linking that I mentioned earlier. So the leader's responsibility is communicating what the organization, via the parent circle, needs of this circle, right? So our sustainable growth circle needs us to do sales. That's what the leader is continuing to bring into the circle, right? Making sure that we're accountable to accomplishing the things that that circle is mandated to do. The delegate, on the other hand, has the reverse relationship. So they bring what the circle needs from the rest of the organization to effectuate its aims, right? And so an important part of this is to understand that within a circle, the leader and the delegate are full members of that circle, but they're also full members of the parent circle. So they have full consent rights at both levels of the organization. So zooming in on how we actually operate when we're meeting together and doing work, and this is going to be sort of the focus of the majority of the talk moving forward, is we look at how we work together and how we make decisions that are consensual, and then in so doing, trying to make sure that everybody's voice is heard that are participating in these things. So similar to the two structural roles, we also have a couple of meeting roles. The facilitator is the MC, if you will. They're the person who kind of helps the meeting happen, will prompt people at the different stages of the meeting, of the different sections, will help if somebody is having difficulty articulating themselves, might engage with them to try to help them to specify what they're trying to say, and also is sort of empowered to interrupt people. So generally we don't want to interrupt people, but if you're rambling and things are going off out of focus, kind of guiding us back onto focus. Secretary's job, primarily documenting decisions, taking notes. They don't have to do it independently. They're the sort of the backstop of making that happen. Generally, we do that in a participatory manner where everybody's in the equivalent of a shared Google Doc or something where we can all type as we go, but the secretary is sort of responsible for making sure that that happens. They were also empowered to interrupt occasionally and make sure that we've captured what somebody is saying in a relevant way. And that's sort of the key piece to how we make sure that that transparency is happening. So let's take a look at what a meeting actually looks like. So what you're going to see that's different here from a lot of meetings is that there's a fairly structured way of approaching it, especially in terms of the participation. What this avoids is big personalities kind of taking over and people who are more introverts sitting back and just letting things happen, right? So that's sort of the main thing that we need to try to overcome in this context, and there's specific ways that we go about doing it. The main one is speaking in rounds. So we all have experience with this. It may go all the way back to kindergarten, but it's how we got to learn not to interrupt each other and to be polite, right? However, in most meetings, it's what we refer to as popcorn, right? Whoever has something to say is saying it. Usually it's going to end up being dominated by 2, maybe 3 people, and a lot of people are just going to disengage and have that feeling of like, just email me the results, why am I here, right? So basically, you already know how this works. We just talk in turn. Usually what will happen is the facilitator will have, we're entirely remote, so they'll have a list of the people that are in the meeting, in Zoom or Jitsi or whatever, and they'll just call them out in order. And that's how it works. And we each take a turn. We try to keep it relatively succinct. We want to get our point across. We don't want to ramble. It's not meant to be a therapy session. There is a point where we can talk about how we're feeling, but in rounds, the main thing is that we keep it going and we respect each other's time. And the main thing is to try to elicit from people who are generally quieter, get their voices heard, right? And this will take a little while, right? It's not like it's going to just flip a switch, but by prompting people on an ongoing basis and by respecting their time, we see that it really does work fairly quickly. Every time we do this with an organization, the very first time, it feels awkward because we're not used to dealing with things in this very structured way. However, the feeling is that it's slower. The feeling is that it's unnatural for people to be called on to speak who don't normally speak. But everybody, by the end of the first session, is usually enthusiastic to use it from then forward. By the first, after the first 10 minutes, everybody's into it, it's easy, and people feel really comfortable with it. First couple times talking in rounds is weird, but you get used to it really quickly. So then we're going to look at consent-based decision-making here. So this is, again, another structured process where there's different phases. Sometimes we can short-circuit pieces of this, but generally the way it's going to be is that we're going to do a round or two where we're just trying to make sure we understand what the problem is we're trying to solve, right? We're going to explore it. We're going to look at dimensions of what we need to consider. Generally from there, some kind of solution is starting to form after a couple of rounds like that. And so usually what we'll try to do is put forward a proposal in a draft form early on. We'll get some reactions from the group, so we'll do another round where people are reacting, making suggestions for how to improve the proposal. And then generally from there, we're going to test for consent right away, which is really what checking for objections is. Consent is basically just not having objections. Okay? Now, there's some confusion sometimes about the difference between consent and consensus. You've probably heard the term consensus a lot more than consent in this context. Excuse me. Consensus is the name of my company, so I'm a big fan of that term. But the way we use it is what's referred to as weak consensus. Strong consensus is how most people consider this, and that's really unanimity. Unanimity is not a goal that we should be trying to achieve. Okay? Unanimity would mean that we're all looking at the preferred solution, right? If we have 2 or 3 options available to us, what we're looking for is something that's acceptable to everybody, not necessarily everybody's favorite, right? So it's a zone of tolerance is another way that we refer to it. So when we're talking about consent, we're saying there's no reasoned objections. And a reasoned objection in this context is, if we do this, it's going to make it harder for us to achieve our aims. That's the framing that we need to put into it. So it's not, this isn't my favorite option. It's not, I don't like it. It's not, it makes me feel uncomfortable. It has to be framed in a way that's relevant to the circle and what our aims are in that circle. And so that's what we mean when we talk about consent. So in a project, why does this matter? Well, we have been doing agile development for a long time. And what happens in a lot of cases is, you'll be talking and we'll be like, okay, so we're going to do this and this and this, right? A beat, and we move on. Now, in my mind, everybody agreed that that's the plan, right? But a lot of people don't even understand that we made a decision in that brief silence, right? So what ends up happening is we come back to it a week or 2 later, a month or 2 later, and people don't remember having agreed to something. They don't recall the conversation because we weren't taking notes, etc. Consent is that we actually ask for people to say explicitly, yes, I consent, or I have no objections, right? One or the other, they mean the same thing. So,
I'm sorry, I can late. I'm not sure if I can ask questions now.
Yeah, by all means, go ahead.
Sometimes the consent, it could be complicated. If you don't speak now, or if you keep silent, it means that you consented to that. Do we need really to say, okay, I consent, or the silence thing, even if it's like written somewhere, it could be considered as consent?
So we used to operate, before we adopted Sociocracy, we still operated on a consensus basis, and that's the way that we did it. We would ask for if there were any objections, and if nobody said anything, we'd say, okay, we've made this decision. The problem is, if you're not actively asking people for their voice on a matter, a lot of people are just going to be uncomfortable bringing something up. So we do ask for specific consent, so to say I consent or I have no objections in a round. So we just do a consent round and everybody is called on in order, right? We find that it really sort of forces people to be clear that they're not just remaining silent and silently standing aside, right? One of the problems with consensus in a sort of weak consensus mode is that there is this idea of standing aside, right? But standing aside is saying, I disagree with you, but I'm not going to block it. And then when things go wrong, I'll be proven right, right? That's the approach that is like psychologically what's going on. That's not a healthy thing for the organization, for the people involved. What you want is for them to express their objection. Objections are golden because objections are reasons why this won't work. And so then we have to rethink about how we're going to do things and get a better solution out of it. So we really do want to elicit objections. And most of the time, objections come in the form of, well, I think this is a little risky. Why don't we try it for 6 months and see, right? Or have we considered this? Or and there are sort of more questions. And so that's what that collaborative building of the proposal ends up being. Any other questions at this point? Okay. So in this context, in a project, we're usually using this in a sort of more agile framework, right? So what we're asking people to do is consent to the summary of what features were delivered, right, in a sprint review, right? We're consenting to the things that we've elicited in a retrospective, right? What could have gone better, and what are we going to try to do next time, right? We're consenting explicitly to the scope for the next sprint, right? These are the kinds of things that we make a habit of when we're working on in this kind of context. So another aspect of all of this is everybody needs to participate. And if people aren't participating, they probably shouldn't be there. And we should be flexible about letting them not be there, right? There's really no point in somebody just checking out and just being like, no, I have nothing to say. I have nothing to say. Now, it's okay if that's the case sometimes. But generally speaking, what we want is for each meeting to be relevant to everybody that's there. And so if they're finding that it's not relevant, they just shouldn't be there. They probably don't have anything to say. Or if they only have something to say on one topic that's going to be covered third, then maybe what we need is a subcircle, right? One that addresses those kind of things. And then only the people who care about that particular topic are going to be there. It does add some complexity because you need to make sure there's that transparency between, but yeah, go ahead.
How do you, I see a little bit of a clash. You mentioned earlier about the inclusiveness to your meetings, yet now we're focusing on certain people. You're trying to get voices out of everyone for stuff that may not have context or relevance in the room, and they may not need to be there. So how do you determine that, the value of the person to include?
Well, okay, so I would frame it as like, is this relevant to them, right? Is the things that are being discussed relevant? So let's use a project context, right? If it was a larger project and you might have like a security team and you might have a development team and you might have a design team, let's say, just for simplicity's sake, does it make sense to have a meeting where all 12 people or whatever are there? And when you're talking about the design aspects, the other 8 people, assuming it's 4 apiece, it's just not relevant to them, really. Maybe there'll be some overlap, but generally it's not going to be. And so people are kind of checked out for 2/3 of the time in that context. It's not that they don't have anything to say about the project, or in this case, a project. It's that not every conversation is going to be relevant to everybody that's participating. And so what I would suggest doing in a bigger project like that is actually having some subcircle, so design subcircle, security subcircle, and a programming subcircle or whatever. And then bear in mind, the delegates and leaders from each of those subcircles would still be meeting at the project level. But now those people are representing that subcircle and they're full members of the further one. So when people are summarizing what was discussed in security and programming, the design people might be like, oh, that's relevant to us. I need to make sure that we address that. But we don't have all of those people necessarily there who aren't paying attention on that basis. Right? So that's kind of how we try to manage it. It's not, there's no, I know people who have a lot more to say about that. There's sort of a balance, right? And it really comes down to, there's a rule in some sort of non-hierarchical engagements of the rule of 2 feet, right? If you don't feel like you're participating in an effective manner, use your feet and do something that you feel is more productive, right? Like it's a matter of, there's a consent that's implicit in just being there and participating that is also valuable, right? And so if we're talking about things and we make a decision and then you come back and we're like, well, why wasn't I consulted, right? Then that's a challenge that we need to address as well, right? Because it's like, well, this is where we make those decisions. You ought to be there if you care enough, right? So there's a lot to balance on that basis. At a project level, it generally it isn't usually an issue, I find. Most projects are of the right size that we can do this without having to subdivide. But on larger ones where it is like, there's going to be 2 or 3 people and it's really more of a presentation that you're doing. It's not really a meeting where people are expected to participate. So that's kind of where we try to make it work. Does that make sense? Yes. I mean, I know it doesn't answer, like it's hard. Like I'm not saying that part's easy. But that's why I'm not going to talk about it. So because child circles do engage more overhead, right? Because you do need to have a separate meeting where that's happening, and you have people who are going to be in 2 meetings now to communicate that. Delegation is hard, right? Trusting the subcircle to make decisions and to not relitigate them, that's a challenge, right? So if you can avoid it, if the team can remain small enough, then it's not something you need. If you do, then there's some other things and tools like Synchrony can help. Right? For whatever it's worth, it's really important that you have specific aims, right? That you're clear about what everybody's trying to do, and if you're delegating something, you're delegating a portion of that aim, right? So, that's how you can sort of define what it is that the subcircle is going to be responsible for, and trust that they're going to take care of that. All right, so how do meetings actually work? This is the structure of the meeting. Okay, so we're going to have a check-in. We're going to do what we refer to as admin. That's an acronym. We're going to do follow-up and reports. We're going to have the actual meat of the meeting, the agenda, and then we're going to do a little check-in. So let's take a look at what each of these is. The check-in, very brief, usually no more than 2 minutes. Everybody just kind of, what are they bringing to the table, right? This is a really useful way to help engage those people early on who are not used to participating in a meeting, because how are you feeling today is something they can answer, right? They may not say much. It might just be, I'm doing okay, right? I try to bring something to the table. Like often I'll try to lower expectations a little bit, and I'll be like, yeah, I didn't sleep very well last night, so I'm a little all over the place, and if I start to ramble, feel free to bring me back to focus, right? Little things like that gives people the opportunity, especially as somebody who talks a lot in meetings, for people to interrupt me and to keep us focused. It's permission I'm sort of giving in that context. But by showing how you can be, a little bit open about how you're feeling, what's going on in your life, and so forth, it really helps people to understand how you're reacting to things, right? If I didn't sleep well, then that's going to affect my participation in this meeting, and people shouldn't feel like if I'm yawning, it's because I think what you're doing is boring, right? And it's surprising how few people are in touch with how they're actually feeling. So it helps people to really center themselves a little bit and participate in the meeting. It's 2 minutes, but it's a huge investment in terms of the return that you get on that investment. If there's one thing that I would suggest you do, it's this, just in terms of getting people engaged in meetings early on. So admin is basically just the logistics, right? It's admin stands for attendance, duration, minutes, information, and the next meeting. We just make sure this stuff is out of the way up front. Who's supposed to be here, who is, how long do we have in this meeting? Did we publish the minutes from last time? Is there any information? I have a hard stop at 11, so feel free to continue after that, but I'm going to have to drop off, that kind of thing. And when's the next meeting? Right? Get all of that out of the way. It's not something that we're going to forget later on. Then we do follow-ups. These are usually also fairly short. This is just how we hold each other accountable. So last time we had a to-do for Derek to do this and Christopher to do that. Where are we with that, right? If I'm not getting it done, it becomes clear, and then that's an opportunity for somebody to offer to take it off my plate, because I have a ton of things that are on my plate, and often I'm one of the people who isn't getting everything done all the time. Right? So these are usually fairly quick. If there is a need for help, we can just ask for it and say, let's follow up after the meeting. If there's something that needs discussion, it goes on the agenda. So we don't want to derail this and have a full discussion about something. You can just identify, okay, there's something that needs to be talked about. Let's put it on the agenda. Reports are only usually relevant if you do have subcircles. It's how you communicate what's going on in the subcircle to the parent circle. That's what a report is, basically. It's updates, progress, etc. If there's issues, if they need something, etc. Again, anything that requires any kind of discussion that's not purely informational goes on the agenda. The agenda is the vast majority of the meeting. It's where you're going to have discussions, where you're trying to make sense of things, right? Something went wrong. We had a deployment that we had to roll back. What happened? How can we avoid it in the future? So that sort of sense-making discussion. Exploration, we've got some new feature, or we're going to be moving from one cloud provider to another, and we're going to have to handle that. Sort of figuring out and understanding what it is that we need to deal with. And then decisions. What's the plan? How are we going to proceed? Is this something that we're going to have to do repeatedly, so maybe we need to write a policy about it? Or is it just, this is how we're going to operate in this particular context? So that's the majority of it. We use rounds and consent, right? So those two tools generally are sufficient here. We'll do rounds until everybody has sort of, addressed everything that they want to say. Often after 2 rounds, we will do what we call a popcorn round, as I mentioned earlier, right? So if we've had a couple rounds where a few people have said, yeah, I don't have anything to add, then it's just, okay, anybody have anything else? And then we tie it up. And then checkout is sort of the inverse of the check-in, but it allows us to kind of reflect on what went well in this meeting. It's sort of a micro retrospective. It's how you get that continuous improvement, right? So if some people got upset, we can kind of address it here, right? What might have happened? How might we have addressed this in a different way that might not have led to that? We can suggest improvements. And really importantly is expressing appreciation. So, you know what? This particular part went really well. I really appreciated how, Jane approached this particular topic, right? And that way you can learn from how it worked. And getting feedback, positive feedback, is something that we very rarely get. And so doing so in a small, tight-knit group really helps to build trust and engagement in the project. So the thing is that all of this is meant to balance the various requirements within a project, right? We're people, we have limitations, we have family and life outside of work, but we also want to feel that what we're doing is useful and helpful. But there's also a process, and we need to be making progress on it. We're not here just to be talking. So let me show you a couple of, so we talked about the organization stuff. Let me talk a little bit about how we use this in a discovery workshop. So this is a type of project where a client generally knows that they need to do something, but they haven't really got a handle on it. They're not aligned about how to do it, so they'll bring out a third-party consultant, mostly frankly, to identify stakeholders. Here I've listed aligning stakeholders, but a lot of times they don't even know who's going to be affected by it, right? So the first step is going to be finding out who the stakeholders are, talking to them, making sure that everybody's on the same page, defining the scope of the project, what's realistic, starting to put together a roadmap, what are the risks, etc., right? So that's sort of the goal of a discovery project. We've done a lot of these, and what we were finding is that they were working well, but generally speaking, it was the people who were already talking that were just talking. So when we started bringing in sociocratic practices, after we had been doing it for 6 or 8 months, we started to apply it in this context. And speaking in rounds immediately started to surface all kinds of stuff that we weren't hearing otherwise, right? From all the people who had been there for 10, 12 years at an organization, who had all kinds of concerns and issues and gripes. Now they finally had a way to bring it up in the context of building out the scope of a project that might help address those problems, right? But the actual people who are using these tools or operating this process or whatever. And then affirming agreement with consent was really important because it showed that everybody, to them, that they were in agreement, like explicitly. Because a lot of times conversation will just kind of peter out, and then it'll be, well, I guess we're going to do this, right? Instead of explicitly building proposals that everybody could really get on board with. So the consistency of the results were great. The feedback has always been excellent. So this is how we do things now. I did this with the Drupal Association about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, for some of the supply chain security stuff that I've been working with them on since then. Exceedingly complex topic. Various people from various companies and organizations and stakeholders that were involved. Very high stakes, right? It was the security of the entire ecosystem that they were looking to try to resolve. And everybody thought that everybody else didn't understand what they were trying to say. So what we started with, that was what I heard coming into it, right? So what I started out with was some individual stakeholder interviews, just to make sure I understood sort of broadly. I had no idea what supply chain security was at this point. So I needed to just understand sort of the foundations of it and sort of figure out to build what the agenda would look like for these workshops. Capturing their concerns, and then we ran these sociocratic workshops. In the first session, everybody realized that they were actually aligned. Everybody thought they were talking past each other, but in fact, everybody was pretty much agreed on the path forward. They were just using different terminology or expressing different priorities. So the feedback from that first session was, this is great, I feel like I've been heard. From everybody. Everybody said that. And everybody was feeling like they hadn't been, right? By the end of the second session, we had a full roadmap that everybody was consenting to enthusiastically, and we then just were able to roll right into the project to great success. So the main thing here to come away from with that particular example was that they just weren't listening in a structured fashion. Right? They would come into these meetings, they had had 3 or 4 of them. They were big meetings with lots of people participating, but nobody was really running the meeting, facilitating the meeting. And that's where things kind of started to come apart. Okay, so I think I'm running out of time. So I'm going to go forward a little bit quickly here. I'm wrapping it up. So I've already talked about quite a bit of this. Agile project delivery is primarily iterative, incremental work. It delivers in sprints. You have a 2 or 3 week kind of time frame within which you're trying to deliver some features. And you're continuously planning what are you going to do next and reviewing and sort of signing off on things rather than trying to come up with a full list and specify everything up front. So more often than not, these meetings that are happening on a regular basis, a lot of people are going to be checking out. They're going to talk about the features they worked on. That's about it. And there's the usual patterns of the people who talk a lot are going to talk a lot. That's just how it's going to work, right? The other thing is that depending on what their focus is on any given time, the priorities and the guidance for the project is going to shift a little all over the place. So you not having that clear aim that everybody's sort of trying to keep us geared towards really sort of affects that. So as I mentioned, we do this in our sprint planning review and retrospectives. We generally have 1 meeting every 2 weeks where we just have three items on the agenda. The review of what we did over the last 2 weeks, the retrospective on how well it went and what we might want to do differently this next time, and then planning for the next 2 weeks. Instead of breaking it up into separate meetings and doing all this ritualistic stuff, we basically just treat them as individual agenda items, and it goes really, really smoothly. And so what this makes sure of is that we're clear about what are we achieving, right? What are we going to try to do next? And if we're making any changes to the plans, what are the trade-offs, and being in agreement about the approach that we're going to be taking, right? Now, the difference about doing this in a project versus at an organizational level is that we don't have that tied to the rest of the organization. Usually there'll be a project manager or a sponsor of some sort that's kind of bringing what the requirements of the organization is, what the limitations are, what the budget is, the schedule, et cetera, et cetera. But within the meetings, within the project team, we can operate sociocratically, and that works fine. Because essentially at every level of a sociocratic organization, it's just a microcosm of the same dynamic happening. So it's I can't remember the term, but it's not iterative, but the same at every level, fractal almost. Okay? So what we find when we work this way is that everybody's sort of pulling in the same direction. Everybody understands what's expected of them. We adapt to changes faster because we see them coming earlier. We understand what our part is in it, and we've engaged in defining what that part is. And we come out of it with a higher confidence that we're going to be able to succeed, even though the definition of success is going to be changing over time, right, depending on what you're facing. So the main thing here is that with Agile, we kind of just assume that we're all in alignment. The Scrum Master and the product owner and so forth are kind of the people who really matter in terms of that. Everybody else just has to kind of suck it up. That's generally the dynamic that I've seen. I'm being a little disingenuous there, but whatever. With Sociocracy, because we're engaging everybody in these decisions, including, yes, that is what we agreed to, right, and what we accomplished and so forth. We're really making that front and center. So the tools, as I mentioned, are rounds. This is really easy to implement in meetings. It's the thing that probably affects meetings the most. Is just making sure that you're giving yourself permission to stop the people who are going to dominate the meeting from dominating the meeting. And the easiest way to do that is with a check-in, as a starting point, right? Just getting people over that initial discomfort. Consent decision making is a little more complex because there's power dynamics and there's different things going on in an organization. But generally speaking, within the context of a project, it can be something that can be achieved, especially if it's scoped to things like, I consent to this is the scope of what we achieved in this past sprint, right? Having clear roles, who's responsible for what, right? And then having those meetings structured in a way that gives people some visibility into what's going to happen. They understand when they're going into a meeting that it's not depends if Derek's going to be there, whether it's going to be a good meeting or a bad meeting, right? That kind of thing. So yeah, introduce rounds, right? Try consent for small decisions where there's not high stakes and people are really invested yet, right? Clarify roles, just making sure that people understand what's expected of them and hold them accountable to it. And then you can kind of build from there. These are relatively small changes, but they can have really big impacts on projects. So I really do recommend it. As I said, there's this conference next week hosted by Sociocracy for All. They offer all kinds of training and books and other things that are great resources. They've got videos on YouTube and lots of articles about how all of this stuff works. If there's interest on your part in this, there's a lot of resources to be able to get more involved and to see how this can work. That's it. Thank you very much. So I'll open it.